Tonight, on the Midnight Drive, some houses become landmarks. Others become museums. And every now and then, they become something else entirely. In Salem, Oregon, the Bush House has welcomed visitors for generations. People come to admire its craftsmanship, learn about the family who lived there, and step inside a home that has witnessed more than a century of Oregon history. Some leave talking about the architecture, and others leave talking about the footsteps, or the feeling that someone else was quietly walking through the hallways. As I started reading about Bush House, I realized I was spending less time thinking about the ghost stories and more time imagining what it must have been like to simply live there. Tonight, we're stepping inside one of Oregon's most remarkable homes and wondering why some houses continue telling stories long after the families have gone. Have you ever noticed that there's something almost universal about an old house? You don't have to know who lived there, and you don't have to know when it was built. You step inside, and almost immediately, your imagination just gets to work. Who looked out this window? Who carried groceries through that doorway? Who learned to walk across those floorboards? These are the questions. Old houses seem to invite those questions without ever even asking them out loud. The Bush House sits on a quiet rise in Salem, Oregon, surrounded by towering trees that have watched the city change around them for generations and generations. The home itself is striking. Italianate architecture, broad porches, tall windows, and carefully crafted woodwork that still catches the afternoon light much the way it did more than a century ago. It's beautiful, but not in a grand, untouchable sort of way. It feels lived in. You can almost picture someone opening the front door before you've ever even stepped inside. And that's probably because, for a very long time, someone always did. Before it became a museum, and before it became a stop on a ghost tour, and before it became one of Oregon's best-known historic homes, it was simply somebody's house. Asahel Bush and his family built their lives here during a period when Oregon itself was still finding its footing. Bush was a newspaper publisher, a businessman, an influential figure in the state's early political history. The house became more than a residence. It reflected a family growing alongside a young state, welcoming visitors, raising children, celebrating holidays, and settling into the everyday routines that quietly make a place feel like a home. And that's the part I kept coming back to. It's not the headlines, it's not the history books, it's the ordinary days. It's Monday mornings. Rain tapping softly against the windows. Someone hurrying down the staircase because breakfast was almost ready. A child racing through the hallway after being told not to run indoors. Those are the moments that rarely survive in the historical record. But you want to know what? They happened. Thousands of times. Every old home has witnessed countless ordinary moments that no one thought to write down. And somehow, I think those are the moments that are easiest to imagine. As the years passed, Salem continued to grow. Generations came and went. And eventually, the Bush family was no longer living in the home, and the house entered a new chapter as a museum. preserving not only its architecture, but also the stories of the people who once called it home. What an interesting transition, right? The purpose of a house changes. Instead of making new memories, it begins preserving old ones. Visitors walk through rooms where complete strangers once laughed together. They climb staircases worn smooth by people whose names they'll never know. They pause in front of family photographs, trying to imagine lives that were once as ordinary as their own. It's a different way of experiencing history. Not through dates, through literal rooms. And you know, maybe that's why old houses affect us a little bit differently than monuments. Let's think about that a little bit. A monument asks you to remember an event. And a house quietly asks you to imagine a life. Somewhere along the way, Bush House gathered another reputation because visitors began sharing stories. A door closing when no one was nearby, or the footsteps overhead after all the rooms had emptied out. A figure glimpsed at the end of a hallway before disappearing around a corner. Museum staff have shared experiences they couldn't easily explain. And guests have left convinced they weren't entirely alone. It's a little bizarre, right? Others have toured the house and experienced absolutely nothing unusual at all. It's always interesting how those stories rarely become the first thing that people talk about. Instead, they usually begin with the house itself. It's beautiful. You should see the woodwork. The gardens are incredible. Then, almost as a fleeting afterthought, oh, and someone told me this place might be haunted. What? Of course, it made me smile when I heard that, because it feels so backwards from the way that so many of these stories are often presented. Right? Usually, it starts with a, oh, I heard, ... Remember that from the other night? But not this one. This place is so striking that people talk about the aesthetic of it and the beauty of it. And then as an afterthought, oh yeah, I heard this place might be haunted. The house came first. The family came first. The everyday life came first. And the stories arrived later. And maybe that's worth keeping in mind as we walk through the front door. That said, as we've talked about countless times on the show, if you go into Bush House expecting to see something, expecting to hear something, or expecting to experience something, there's a good chance that you probably will. After the break, I'd like to spend a little time with those stories. Not to decide whether they're true, but to look at something I found much more interesting. Why do certain houses become known for ghosts, while countless other houses quietly grow old without ever collecting a single legend? What do you make of this? More coming up next right here on the Midnight Drive. Now, let's talk about when a house becomes a story, okay? There's a question I kept carrying with me after leaving the Bush house. Why this house? Not why do people report footsteps, not why someone thought they saw a figure in the hallway. Why do certain homes seem to gather ghost stories while others simply grow old? I don't think it's because they're older. There are lots of older houses. And I don't think it's because more people have lived there. There are plenty of homes that have welcomed generations of families without ever becoming part of local folklore. So what changes? I started thinking about the houses I visited over the years. Some belonged to grandparents, some to old friends. Some were museums, like Bush House. Almost every single one of them had something in common. They didn't feel empty, even when there was no one there. And I'm not talking about in a supernatural way, just in a familiar way, in a comforting way almost. You walk into an old kitchen, and you can almost hear someone asking if you'd like another cup of coffee. You notice a staircase, and it's easy to picture children racing down it on Christmas morning. A worn armrest on a wooden chair quietly suggests that someone had a favorite place to sit. Now, think about this, because those are not ghost stories. They're little observations, little clues left behind by ordinary life. And maybe that's why old homes affect us so differently than abandoned buildings. It's a pretty big difference. An abandoned factory feels deserted. An old home rarely does. It feels as if it's been paused in time. As though the people have simply stepped outside for a little while. They'll be back later. I noticed something else while reading visitor accounts from Bush House. The experiences themselves are remarkably ordinary. A footstep, a door, a voice heard from the other room, the sense that someone might be nearby. None of those things sound especially dramatic on their own. In fact, most of us have probably had moments like that in perfectly normal places. You think you hear someone call your name. You could have sworn you left a door open. You glanced down a hallway because, just for an instant, you thought that someone walked past. And usually, there's a very simple explanation, isn't there? But every now and then, there isn't. Life is full of those moments that never quite get resolved. And maybe that's all right. One of the things I appreciate about places like Bush House is that they don't ask visitors to choose a side. You walk through the house because you love architecture. Great! You walk through the house because you're interested in Oregon history. Wonderful! You walk through the house because you just enjoy old homes. Great! Or maybe you're walking through it because someone told you that it might be haunted. Awesome. The house itself does not change. The thing that changes is the reason that you're there. I think that's one of the biggest strengths of historic places. They make room for different kinds of curiosity. Isn't that cool? Some visitors spend 10 minutes studying the craftsmanship around a fireplace. Someone else can't stop looking toward the staircase. Neither person is experiencing the house incorrectly. They're simply noticing different things. That struck me more than any ghost story. Two people can stand in the exact same room, or look out the exact same window, or hear the exact same floorboards creaking, and carry home entirely different memories of their visit. Maybe that's true of more than just museums. Think about your own childhood home, or your grandparents' house. Ask your brothers or sisters what they remember most. You probably won't get the same answer. It's so interesting. I've been thinking about this for the past couple of weeks. In any family home where there's more than 2 children, none of those children experienced the home the same. They didn't experience their parents the same. Everybody has different accounts. What a wild thing to think about. Anyways, if you ask your siblings what they remember the most about the house that you grew up in, or your grandparents' house, you probably aren't going to get the same answer. Someone remembers the backyard. Someone else remembers the smell of fresh bread in the kitchen. And another remembers the front porch during summer thunderstorms. Same house, different story. I wonder if buildings became interesting for exactly that reason. Not because they preserve one version of the past, but because they hold thousands of them. Every family dinner, every celebration, every difficult conversation, every ordinary Tuesday afternoon. All of it happened under the same roof, long before anyone thought to give the house a plaque, or offer guided tours, or wonder whether footsteps in the hallway belonged to someone who could no longer be seen. As I pulled away from the Bush house, I wasn't thinking about the reports of strange sounds. I kept picturing the front porch, someone sitting there after dinner, watching the sun disappear behind the trees, not realizing that more than 100 years later, complete strangers would stand in the same place, trying to imagine what life had been like. Next time, we'll stay here in Oregon and visit a place where elegance, history, and a century of whispered stories all seem to check in beneath the same roof. Right here on the Midnight Drive.